The largest naval encirclement in Pacific history just went into motion around Taiwan. Over 90 vessels from the People's Liberation Army Navy formed a ring of steel around the island, in what Beijing calls a sovereignty enforcement operation. But here is what makes this different from every previous exercise. The United States 7th Fleet was already positioned inside that perimeter before the Chinese ships even began moving. This was not a reaction. This was a chess move played 3 steps ahead. By the time we are done, you will understand why what looks like a Chinese show of force might actually be the moment Beijing realized it no longer controls the board. Welcome to States News. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications because what is unfolding in the Taiwan Strait right now is not just another military exercise. This is the clearest indication yet of how fundamentally the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific has shifted, and most coverage is missing the actual story. I am going to show you exactly how this confrontation developed, why the timeline reveals something Beijing did not intend to expose, and what the carrier positioning tells us about American strategic doctrine that has quietly evolved over the past 18 months. We will cover the specific capabilities the U.S. deployed inside Taiwan's territorial waters, the technical limitations of China's encirclement strategy that naval analysts are only now beginning to understand, and the second-order effects this standoff is creating across alliance structures from Tokyo to Canberra. By the end, you will understand why this moment represents either the last major intimidation play China can credibly execute or the opening move in something far more dangerous. To understand why this encirclement is different, you need to understand what Taiwan represents in the broader architecture of Indo-Pacific security. The island sits at the geographic center of the first island chain, a series of archipelagos running from Japan through Taiwan to the Philippines and Indonesia. Control of Taiwan would give China unfettered access to the Pacific Ocean, breaking the geographic containment that has defined American naval supremacy in the region since 1945. Without Taiwan, the People's Liberation Army Navy remains largely bottled up in the East and South China Seas, forced to pass through choke points that the United States and its allies can monitor and, in conflict, blockade. This is not abstract strategy. This is the geographic reality that shapes every military decision both Beijing and Washington make in this theater. For decades, the strategic balance relied on a simple calculus. China lacked the amphibious capability to invade Taiwan, and the United States maintained overwhelming naval superiority in the Western Pacific. That calculus has been eroding for 15 years. China now operates 3 aircraft carriers with 2 more under construction. Its amphibious fleet has grown from virtually nothing in 2010 to over 40 major vessels capable of transporting troops and armor across the 100-mile strait. The submarine fleet has expanded to roughly 60 boats, mixing older diesel-electric designs with newer nuclear-powered attack submarines that can challenge American undersea dominance. Most critically, China has deployed what defense analysts call anti-access area denial capabilities, long-range anti-ship missiles, advanced air defense systems, and submarine networks designed specifically to keep American carriers far enough from Taiwan that their aircraft cannot provide effective support during an invasion. The United States response has been equally dramatic but far less visible. The forward deployment of the 7th Fleet has intensified. What used to be occasional freedom of navigation operations became routine transits through the Taiwan Strait. Intelligence sharing with Taiwan reached levels that would have been unthinkable during previous administrations. And something else happened that only became clear in the past 6 months. The United States stopped reacting to Chinese exercises and started pre-positioning forces based on intelligence about planned People's Liberation Army movements. That shift represents a fundamental change in operational doctrine. Instead of responding after China makes a move, American commanders began placing assets exactly where they would create maximum complications for Chinese plans before those plans executed. Taiwan itself has transformed its defense posture. The traditional focus on matching China's military buildup shifted toward what strategists call a porcupine strategy, making invasion so costly and complicated that Beijing cannot achieve quick victory. This means thousands of anti-ship missiles positioned along the coast, mobile air defense systems that can disperse and survive initial strikes, and integration of civilian infrastructure into military planning so that every port and airfield can support defensive operations. The Taiwanese military has also invested heavily in asymmetric capabilities like naval mines and coastal defense cruise missiles, weapons that multiply the risks China would face in any amphibious operation. Now let's talk about what actually happened starting on April 18th. Chinese state media announced a major naval exercise around Taiwan, framing it as routine training. The announcement came at 6 a.m. Beijing time, By noon, open-source intelligence analysts using satellite imagery and ship tracking data identified over 90 People's Liberation Army Navy vessels converging on positions around Taiwan from three directions. The Northern Theater Command deployed forces from bases near Qingdao. The Eastern Theater Command, which has operational responsibility for Taiwan contingencies, pushed vessels from bases along the Fujian coast. Even the Southern Theater Command contributed destroyers and frigates that had been operating in the South China Sea. This represented the largest coordinated Chinese naval movement in the region ever recorded. The formations created concentric rings at varying distances from Taiwan's coast. The inner ring, positioned roughly 30 nautical miles from shore, consisted primarily of Type 052D destroyers and Type 054A frigates, modern surface combatants equipped with advanced air defense systems and anti-ship missiles. These vessels established what Beijing called a sovereignty enforcement perimeter. The middle ring, 60 to 80 nautical miles out, included larger Type 055 destroyers, the most capable surface combatants in the Chinese fleet. These ships carry 112 vertical launch cells capable of firing everything from cruise missiles to long-range surface-to-air missiles. The outer ring extended to roughly 200 nautical miles and included supply vessels, intelligence collection ships, and submarines operating in patrol zones designed to detect and track any approaching forces. Here is where the story gets genuinely interesting. The USS Ronald Reagan, a Nimitz-class supercarrier, was already operating inside that inner perimeter when the Chinese encirclement began. Not approaching from outside, not racing to respond, already there. The carrier had transited the strait 5 days earlier during what was publicly described as a routine patrol, except there was nothing routine about the timing or the position. The Reagan sat roughly 25 nautical miles east of Taiwan's coast, accompanied by two Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, the USS Milius and USS Howard, and the Ticonderoga-class cruiser, USS Chancellorsville. That is a full carrier strike group positioned exactly where it would complicate any Chinese attempt to enforce the encirclement they were about to announce. The tactical implications are immediate and significant. A Nimitz-class carrier operating that close to Taiwan can launch F/A-18 Super Hornets that reach any point around the island in minutes. The air wing on the Reagan includes roughly 60 aircraft, strike fighters, electronic warfare aircraft, early warning planes, and helicopters. Those aircraft can establish air superiority over the strait, provide close air support to Taiwanese forces, or strike Chinese naval vessels attempting to approach invasion beaches. The presence of Aegis-equipped destroyers and cruisers adds layered air defense that can intercept Chinese missiles targeting either the carrier or Taiwan itself. This is not a symbolic presence. This is combat capability positioned exactly where it changes the operational calculus for any Chinese commander contemplating escalation. But the strategic implications go several levels deeper. The positioning reveals that American intelligence knew about China's planned encirclement exercise before Beijing made it public. That intelligence allowed pre-positioning rather than reaction. Think about what that means for a moment. China cannot execute a major naval operation in its home waters without the United States knowing in advance and positioning forces to complicate it. That represents a fundamental erosion of China's ability to achieve surprise, which is critical for any military operation and absolutely essential for amphibious assault. If China cannot mass forces for an exercise without American awareness, it certainly cannot mass forces for invasion without triggering American response. The second-order effects extend to alliance structures across the region. Japan watched this unfold with particular attention. The Reagan operates from Yokosuka Naval Base in Japan, and its forward deployment inside the Chinese perimeter demonstrates that American security commitments are not abstract promises, but operational reality. Within 48 hours of the encirclement beginning, Japan's Maritime Self-Defense Force deployed 4 destroyers to positions east of Taiwan, not inside the strait, but close enough to provide support if the situation deteriorated. This represents unprecedented Japanese willingness to operate in proximity to a Taiwan contingency, a shift in policy that reflects growing recognition in Tokyo that Taiwan's security directly affects Japanese security. Australia made its own quiet move. The guided missile destroyer HMAS Brisbane, which had been conducting exercises in the South China Sea, altered course toward the Luzon Strait, the waterway between Taiwan and the Philippines. This positioned Australian naval power within striking range of the Taiwan theater for the first time in decades. Canberra made no public announcement, but the message to Beijing was clear. The coalition opposing Chinese regional dominance extends far beyond the United States. Now let's examine the technical limitations of China's encirclement that become visible under scrutiny. 90 vessels sounds overwhelming, and Chinese state media certainly presented it that way. but naval analysts who mapped the actual positions identified critical vulnerabilities. The ships were spread thin across an enormous area. The inner ring covered roughly 400 nautical miles of perimeter. Even with 30 vessels in that ring, that means each ship is responsible for monitoring and controlling a 13-mile section of ocean. Modern naval warfare is not about lines of ships forming impenetrable walls. It is about sensors, missiles, and aircraft operating in integrated networks. The Chinese formation looked impressive on maps but lacked the density to actually prevent determined transit. The submarine component represents another vulnerability that analysts have only recently begun discussing. China deployed an estimated 8 to 12 submarines in support of the encirclement. That number is based on intelligence assessments and cannot be confirmed, but even taking the higher estimate, it means submarines are operating in zones roughly 50 miles square. Modern attack submarines can cover that much area, but doing so effectively requires extensive coordination with surface vessels and maritime patrol aircraft. The People's Liberation Army Navy has practiced this coordination extensively, but it has never executed it under conditions where a peer competitor is actively working to disrupt those networks. American attack submarines, likely at least 2 Los Angeles-class or Virginia-class boats operating in the area, can position themselves to monitor and potentially target Chinese submarines attempting to maintain patrol zones. The air defense picture reveals similar complications. The Type 052D and Type 055 destroyers carry sophisticated air defense systems, the HQ-9 surface-to-air missile comparable to the American SM-2. But air defense requires persistent radar coverage and coordination between multiple platforms. The tyranny of the horizon limits how far even the most advanced radar can see at sea level. A formation spread as thin as China's encirclement creates gaps that agile aircraft can exploit, particularly when operating from a carrier positioned inside the perimeter rather than trying to penetrate from outside. Here is where we need to acknowledge complexity and limitations on both sides. The United States positioned forces inside China's encirclement, but that positioning also creates risk. If this situation escalates beyond exercise into actual conflict, the Reagan Strike Group sits inside what would become an extremely hostile environment. Chinese land-based aircraft could reach the carrier from bases in Fujian province in minutes. The DF-21D and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles that China has deployed specifically to target American carriers could strike from launch points hundreds of miles inland. The carrier's defenses are formidable, but no defense is perfect against saturation attack. The political implications are equally complicated. Taiwan's perspective on this standoff is not simple gratitude for American protection. The carrier's presence escalates tension in ways that create risks for Taiwan itself. If shooting starts, Taiwan bears the immediate consequences, regardless of who wins the broader naval engagement. There are voices in Taipei arguing that American forward deployment, while reassuring in some ways, also removes deterrence based on ambiguity. When American forces are visibly positioned to defend Taiwan, Beijing has less reason to doubt American resolve, which could paradoxically encourage Chinese leaders to act, while they still perceive windows of opportunity. China's perspective deserves serious consideration as well. From Beijing's vantage point, Taiwan is not a separate country, but a province in rebellion, and the encirclement represents legitimate enforcement of sovereignty over Chinese territory. The presence of American forces inside what China considers its territorial waters is not deterrence, but provocation, illegal interference in internal affairs. This framing is not just propaganda for domestic consumption. It reflects genuine belief among Chinese leadership that Taiwan's status is fundamentally different from territorial disputes in the South China Sea or tensions with Japan over the Senkaku Islands. That belief creates dangerous dynamics because it means Chinese leadership may accept higher levels of risk in Taiwan scenarios than they would in disputes where they acknowledge some degree of international disagreement about sovereignty. The unresolved questions are profound. Neither side has clarified what happens next. The Chinese encirclement cannot be maintained indefinitely. Naval exercises, even large ones, eventually conclude because ships need to return to port for maintenance and crew rest. When this exercise ends, does the Reagan remain on station? Does it transit through the encirclement in a visible demonstration that China cannot prevent American movement? Or does it quietly depart to avoid forcing a confrontation neither side wants? These operational decisions carry strategic weight far beyond the immediate moment. The deeper question is whether this represents escalation toward inevitable conflict or the establishment of a new status quo where both powers operate in close proximity without shots fired. The optimistic interpretation is that this exercise demonstrates both sides can manage tension without losing control. The pessimistic reading is that each iteration of exercises and responses normalizes higher levels of military presence and risk, making eventual miscalculation or accident more likely. So what has fundamentally changed? The encirclement demonstrates that China can mass naval power in its near seas on a scale that would have been impossible a decade ago. That represents real growth in Chinese capability that American planners must account for. But the American response demonstrates something equally significant. The United States has adapted its operational doctrine to preempt Chinese moves rather than merely reacting to them. The intelligence capabilities and forward deployment posture that enabled positioning the Reagan inside the perimeter before the encirclement began represent force multipliers that offset some of China's numerical advantages. The broader implications extend to the credibility of American security commitments across the Indo-Pacific. Every ally and partner in the region watched to see whether the United States would respond to China's largest naval demonstration around Taiwan. The answer was not just response, but pre-positioning that turned China's show of force into an inadvertent revelation of limitations. That sends signals to Tokyo, Seoul, Manila, and Canberra that American promises of support rest on operational capability, not just diplomatic statements. What remains uncertain is whether Beijing leadership recognizes the same limitations that outside analysts have identified in the encirclement operation. Authoritarian systems often struggle with honest assessment when military operations reveal capability gaps. If Chinese leadership believes the exercise demonstrated strength rather than exposing vulnerabilities, they may draw exactly the wrong lessons and pursue more aggressive actions in future crises. Conversely, if they recognize that the encirclement failed to achieve its intimidation objectives and exposed coordination challenges, they might pursue either de-escalation or dramatic capability improvements aimed at fixing identified weaknesses. Watch what happens over the next 2 weeks as this exercise winds down. If China maintains the encirclement beyond normal exercise duration, that signals willingness to sustain costs and risks for political messaging. If the formations disperse quickly, that suggests Beijing achieved whatever objectives it set or recognized that continuing carries more risks than benefits. Watch also how the Reagan responds. Does it remain on station or depart? Does it transit through specific sections of the encirclement to make points about freedom of navigation? The tactical decisions both sides make as this situation de-escalates will reveal volumes about their risk tolerance and strategic objectives. The Taiwan Strait remains the most dangerous flashpoint in geopolitics precisely because both Washington and Beijing have defined it as a core interest where they cannot afford to be seen backing down. This latest confrontation might mark the high-water mark of Chinese ability to intimidate through naval presence. Or it might be the opening act of something far larger. Either way, the moment when the world realized the American carrier was already inside the perimeter before the Chinese encirclement began will be studied in staff colleges for decades as an example of how intelligence and pre-positioning can turn apparent weakness into strategic advantage. If this analysis helped you understand what is actually happening in the Taiwan Strait beneath the surface-level coverage, subscribe and turn on notifications. We are covering the submarine dimension of this standoff next, looking at how undersea warfare is playing out in ways that neither side is publicly acknowledging, but that may determine who actually controls these waters when it matters most.